A couple weeks ago, I got an award, and the week after, I got another job. Beware of Greeks bearing gift. I'll talk to you a little bit about that after communion. Don't leave. I have a couple things I want to talk to you about. But let's get on to the gospel today. The Pharisee and the tax collector, or the publican as we used to know him. Another contrast in the gospel, A versus B. If you listen to the gospel, the Pharisee is praying in a mirror. He thinks he's praying to God, but he's talking to himself. He's trying to make a good case for himself. I am pretty decent. Look what I don't do compared to this other guy. And how many times is I used in those couple sentences? I. That's the problem. And then, because it's all about him, he does what human nature leads us to do. We turn on each other and compare ourselves. And if I can find somebody who's worse than I am, I can justify my own being. That's kind of the games that we play with a lot of most comparisons are odious, as they say. It's always apples and oranges. But we do a lot of comparison to justify ourselves. Self-justification versus justification by God. So the challenge of the gospel today is for us to find ourselves, we find ourselves in this conflict between these two men. One who's justifying himself, the other who has no problem identifying himself as a sinner. By the way, when Pope Francis in one of his interviews said, "I am a sinner," they didn't know what to do. Popes usually don't say that. You go around saying, "I'm a sinner." You know, people may think it about us, but we don't say it about ourselves. But the whole notion of the humility, the true sense of self-deprecation of the tax collector, who is a thief, by the way, probably. We're not saying that these guys are morally, that the Pharisee was so wonderful, and both of them were. We're pointing out the dark side of the Pharisee and the humble side of the tax collector, who was probably a crook. When the gospel says that the crook went home justified and the 11 o'clock Sunday morning person didn't, watch out. It was 5 o'clock last night. It's about us. And I want you to think about how we subtly, this is not obvious. The gospel is very obvious. This comparing ourselves is very subtle. And the way we would somehow look for ways to promote ourselves by putting other people down. Men do it in certain ways, women do it in other ways. That's a conversation for another day. We all do it, but in different ways. But we have to think about and try to bring into the light some of the ways in which we don't, without thinking about it, we put other people in their place and beneath ourselves. In the Renew this week, how many are in a Renew group right now? Okay, they're a goodly number. The story is of a man who murdered another man, and over a period of time, the victim's wife met and reconciled and forgave the murderer, who was in prison, and said to him at some point, if you continue to be an advocate for other people and to try to do what you can to make a difference based on your experience, I will lobby for your earlier release from prison. It's a powerful story. Which raised the question in my men's group. Some of you were in the group Thursday night. We got off on the question of, Who do you know in prison? And what do you think about those people in prison? I would say for the most part, we say they are where they need to be. And we have all kinds of negative associations with the people who are there, and we don't have enough room to put these people in. And thank God they're in there because we're safer. Now that's very unspoken stuff, and sometimes it's rather blatant. But stepping back from that, not all the people who need to be in prison are in prison, by the way. However, it is the stigma that is attached to a person who has a criminal record. And how do we look at prisoners in the community? People who have done wrong seriously and may not even be able to change. Who knows? This is very complex. It's not just a social problem. It's a mystery, too, the mystery of evil and how people are seduced by it and their whole lives become skewed and destroyed because of it. This is a mystery, not just a social problem. And this comes into faith, too. Everybody at some level, at a core level, needs to see their own goodness, even after we have screwed up seriously. So I was thinking, what if we create a new program in the parish, and I figure out a way to assign every family in this parish a prisoner to be in touch with and to communicate with. Do you think I'd be railroaded out of this town? I'll go to Leechburg. I think I could get a welcome there. We'll talk about that later. But think about now, believe me, I don't have time to even configure how we would do this. However, I'm making a point. I knew a sister at Seton Hill who is now deceased. An elderly, she lived a long life. Sister Marion Claire McGurgan was a elementary and high school teacher, had a love of learning beyond the beyond. And when I was stationed there a long time ago, she was already retired. And she kept going to classes. She was so thirsty, hungry to learn. After, my God, she could have been teaching the classes. But she was, and I remember in her retirement, she kept looking for ways to be useful and to minister to others. She started writing letters to people in the regional correctional facility, prisoners in the Greensburg prison, in the regional correctional facility, and I do think she went to visit them. She was already in her 80s by then, and she was losing her sight, quite handicapped. I'll never forget that. I said, look at this woman who could be a patient and being taken care of, and here she is, ministering, reaching out to people she doesn't know to bridge the gap, and God knows how that was received. My suspicion is it was received very well by those prisoners with whom she communicated. Now, that's one example. Prisoners are one example. But think of the ways in which we subtly use these social issues as a way to polarize. Let's use another example and go out on thin ice. What do I have to lose? Are they going to give me another job? In the American church, over the years, the immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe into this region. Look at New Kensington, look at Leechburg, look at Monessen, many towns in our own diocese, certainly in the Pittsburgh diocese. Ethnic churches. The Italian church, the Polish church, the Slovak church, and usually the German and Irish got put together. And they identified themselves against each other. Now, who were better Catholics? Depending what ethnic group you were in. You weren't like those other people. My God, to marry outside the ethnic group was a mixed marriage. You don't marry those people. But I think, and this is not to cast aspersions, but when you look back, the way we used even our parishes, well, our parish, we're better than their parish. We identify it, we figure some way that we're above it and they aren't. What's the prize? This is nonsense. It really is. We were at a priest convocation this weekend, last week, 2 days, and I heard it was Monsignor Conway, who has corporate memory now. He's one of our older men. Told the story of the founding of the Diocese of Greensburg, which was in 1951. Bishop Lamb, Hugh Lamb, was the auxiliary bishop in Philadelphia and was appointed to be the first bishop of the Diocese of Greensburg, which was Armstrong, Indiana, Westmoreland, and Fayette counties, separated out from the Pittsburgh Diocese, which is now 6 counties. Well, there was a group of priests put together to be the planning committee for the installation and the party of the gathering to celebrate the new diocese. They were Irish and German priests, which left out the Italians and the Slovaks and the Poles and the Lithuanians and whoever else was here. So the committee, the day Bishop Lamb left Philadelphia and came to Greensburg, which he did not consider probably a promotion, so he takes the train to Greensburg. Well, the committee of the Irish and the German priests are at the train station, ready to greet him when he got off the train. The Italians and the Poles and the Slovaks and the Lithuanians and the others were not stupid. They drove to Altoona. They got on the train with the bishop, and when they got to Greensburg, the Irish and the Germans are looking, and who gets off? Not the bishop, but all these other ethnic priests who beat them to the kill. Now it's lore. Who is favored? Who's in and who's out? You know, these stories go on and on and on and on. It's all gamesmanship. We have to make sure that basically our life is not a game about who's better than whoever else is. Because the gospel story says that who promotes him or herself is going to go to the back of the line. And who doesn't is in the front. The last shall be first. How many times does this appear in the gospel? God does not operate like we do. Does not give up on people like we do. Does not have a long memory like we do. That's the good news of the gospel. That has to Easter in us in some way. We are called to be people like that. That's every one of us in some way. There's a time to get down on your knees and grovel and say, Lord, I am not worthy. And what do we do at the beginning of every Mass? We do it. I'm not worthy to do this. We are all sinners. We have fallen short of the glory of God, and we need to be saved, not by our own abilities, but by the merciful love of God, who loves us more than we even love ourselves. That's what Jesus died and rose for. That's what we believe, and that's what we build our house on, and the world in which we live. May we be challenged by this gospel this weekend to see that and to kind of come to terms with where in our own lives we may be playing these games that are always skewed to our own benefit at the expense of others. And with God's grace, seek to let these children's games fall away.